Welcome to another edition in this series of talks organized on behalf of Spiders, the sole platform for initiating discourses on equitable and resilient society. The talks complement a series of original papers published on the Spiders platform dedicated to outlining the building blocks of post-capitalist political economies and societies, not oriented around growth and profit, but rather good lives and a flourishing web of life in times of profound planetary change. Hosting these talks are founder of the peer-to-peer foundation, Michelle Bowens, and myself, Rok Krantz. And today, to help us outline some of these building blocks, we're joined by a distinguished guest, Dr. Blair Fix, author of the paper, Living the Good Life in a Non-Growth World, investigating the role of hierarchy. Happy to have you, Blair.
Oh, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So to start off, we'll kind of pose the standard question here. We pose all our guests, which is kind of what brought you to study the things that you do, specifically the role of hierarchy in societal transitions. So yeah, maybe we think it's really great to know straight from the horse's mouth, so to say, of what kind of brought you to study one of these topics that we're very interested in and think are a kind of key component in thinking through the great challenges of our times.
Well, that's a good question. I will give you the abridged version. The long version would take hours. So, I've had a very winding path in life. I never intended to become an academic. I thought I was going to become a jazz musician, actually. Um, but along the way, I got a little bit disenfranchised with that lifestyle, and I started reading everything really. But I got really interested in ecological economics, so I read some books by Herman Daly, Georgescu Rogan, and just anything I could get my hands on, and kind of realized something I had never thought about before is that we were, every year you read, or not every year, every day almost, you hear politicians talking about growth, 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 and I'd never really thought about it. But when I read this this ecological economics literature, and they said, well, wait a minute, you can't have biophysical growth forever. The planet is finite; it's impossible. And I went, like, of course, of course. So I just got from that moment was obsessed with this idea of limits to growth. So I went back to the very famous book called The Limits to Growth, where they published some of the first modeling of resource limits, and um, just went from there. In grad school, I was very interested in peak oil, which was popular around the time that I started my master's degree. Around 2011 was kind of when interest in peak oil was at a high. Uh, and the whole way through, I was really interested in energy consumption. And um, how I got interested in hierarchy is actually, um, what's the best way to say this quickly? It was basically an accident. I took a course taught at York University. I took a course taught by Jonathan Nitzen, and he was very interested in corporate power. And he said, look, if you want to study capitalism, you have to go out and look at big corporations and actually look at the data. So as part of this course, and a few months later, I was experimenting with the data and looking at corporate concentration, and I found, um, to my surprise, that corporate concentration tended to increase with energy consumption, and I had never seen that correlation before, and so that I kind of got obsessed with it and dug into it. Ended up digging into it for much of my PhD, and the answer that I came up with what was going on here, and what I will talk about in my little presentation shortly, is that this was hierarchy. Um, uh, as energy increased, hierarchy tended to grow. So that it was basically an empirical discovery that after the fact I kind of went back and tried to explain. Since then, I've gotten much more data on it, and it seems to be a fairly robust finding. So it was basically an accident. Like, I was always interested in hierarchy in the sense that I knew I didn't fit into hierarchies very well. Like, I really didn't like ever having a boss, and I didn't like the idea of commanding other people. So in that sense, I've always had a kind of anarchist sensibility, but that wasn't explicitly part of my research ever. So the fact that the focus on hierarchy entered my research was just a kind of empirical accident. But now it's kind of um, defines my research almost. So
Great. Thanks for that short introduction. So yeah, as with all of our guests, we thought to give you a bit of time, however much time you need, to explain a little bit about the core arguments or insights that your paper provides. And if we understand right, you have a kind of presentation prepared.
all right. So I'm going to talk about living the good life in a non-growth world, and I'm going to focus on the role of hierarchy in achieving or perhaps not achieving this goal. Uh, so, degrowth. Well, what is degrowth? Well, it's kind of defined by what it's not. It is not growth. So, for the last 200 years, we've been consuming more and more resources, growing the economy, and it's been a great party, at least for those of us who are lucky to live in rich countries. Uh, but the party is over, right? So, by almost any measure you pick, we've overshot the limits to growth. Here's just one figure. This is the ecological footprint, measures the amount of area needed to support humanity. Uh, According to this measure, we entered overshoot mode in around 1970, and now we're consuming what would take about 1.5 planets to sustain um, inevitably or indefinitely. So we're in overshoot mode, and we need to basically consume less. And that goes by many names, but I think the simplest name is just degrowth. Uh, we need to, if we're in a rich country like I live in Canada, consume less. So, uh, but we at the same time as we need to consume less, I think we need equitable degrowth. We need to live in a just and equitable society for the simple reason that that's what will make life worth living. Now, uh, we now have just overwhelming evidence that that equality makes human welfare better. So the kind of the definitive book on the topic is called The Spirit Level by Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, and they argue that equality is better for everyone, and they just show tons of data uh, that as income inequality increases, human welfare gets worse. And I think that's not hard to understand, right? Humans are a social species. It's our relationships that matter most to us. And when those relationships are unequal or even despotic, it's toxic to our welfare. So, how can we achieve equitable degrowth? Well, the short answer is that we have no idea because no industrial society has tried it successfully yet. But I think there are clues, and I'm going to talk about one of those clues. I'm going to focus on hierarchy. So in my own research, I've found uh, that hierarchy is it's a center of resource consumption and resource distribution. So briefly, what happens as societies consume more energy is that they actually become more hierarchical. Hierarchy tends to grow with energy consumption. At the same time, hierarchy seems to play a key role in how we distribute resources. It seems to be actually a driver of inequality. So I'm going to show you evidence for that. Um, So let's start with this idea that hierarchy grows with energy consumption. Well, the easiest way to see this is to look at firm size. So all of us, by firm I mean companies where we work. Um, Here's a plot. I'm going to talk through it. What I'm basically showing here is that um, as energy use per capita increases, average firm size also increases. So this is a scatter plot. Each dot represents a country. So we can see a trend line here. So as energy use per capita increases, so does the average size of firm. So for instance, Bangladesh is way down here, consumes very little energy and it has small firms, whereas Qatar consumes about 50 times more energy and has much larger firms. So interestingly enough, the way that this actually happens is not most firms getting larger on average. That's what you would picture when I say a shift in the average. You would think about, for instance, human height. If I said people on average got 5 centimeters taller, you'd think literally most people grew 5 centimeters. Well, with companies, with firm size changes, that's not actually what happens. It's a rich get richer dynamic. So uh, the vast majority of firms are small, uh, like think of like a mom and pop operation, and that doesn't change with energy use. What changes is the large firms. So I've plotted a size distribution here, and I don't want to spend too much time going on the details. But what happens, excuse me, is that large firms get larger as energy use increases. So you can call that a rich get richer. So the mom and pop shops, the small businesses stay about the same size, and there are many and many of them. But there are a few large firms like Walmart and Amazon or Microsoft, and they get bigger still. And this happens reliably with more energy consumption. So that's an interesting trend on its own. Well, what does it have to do with hierarchy? Well, I think from your daily experience, just going to work, you know that firms are hierarchies. If you go to work, you probably have a boss, you have maybe even have some subordinates. So it's no surprise, right, that firms are hierarchies. So as firms grow, that implies that hierarchy is also growing. But we can actually go a step further and uh, look at what we think would happen if hierarchy is in fact growing, and we can look at the growth of managers. So a manager's job is to oversee other people. It's a job that couldn't happen without a hierarchy. So managers sit at the top of hierarchies, and if a hierarchy grows, you assume there's going to be more managers. Um, so it turns out that when we look at energy use, it turns out that as energy use increases, so does the relative number of managers. So this is a plot, again, of countries. I've got energy use per capita on the bottom scale and the share of managers in total employment on the vertical scale. And each squiggly line here is the path through time of a country. Uh, Now, the important thing is the overall trend. As energy use per capita increases, the relative number of managers grows. And I'm going to argue that this is indicative of the growth of hierarchy. And I can actually show this with a model. So here's replotting the same data, the growth of managers with energy use. And I can actually show that this is exactly what we would expect, this trend, with a simple model of hierarchy. So in this model, as energy use increases, firm size increases, and firms are hierarchically organized, and at the top of the hierarchy are managers. And we get this rainbow uh, trend. Now, most importantly, uh, is just the average trend. So, um, in the inset plot of the figure, the blue curve is the growth of managers with energy use, and the red curve is the best fit model. So it more or less completely explains why um, um, managers grow with energy use. Now, the take home message, that's kind of some complex modeling there, but the take home message is that this suggests that hierarchy grows with energy use. Now, let's flip gears a little bit and talk about inequality. Hierarchy, I'm going to argue, is a key driver of income inequality. For the simple reason um, that hierarchy concentrates power. So we can have a look at this. So imagine a simple hierarchy, and I've drawn a little illustration of it here. Um, so this is a hierarchy where the lines indicate the chain of command. If we start at the bottom of the hierarchy, somebody at the bottom of the hierarchy has no subordinates. And in this particular hierarchy, if you're in the second rank, you have 2 subordinates. In the third rank, you have 6 subordinates. And as we go up the hierarchy, the number of subordinates grows exponentially. So power is getting concentrated as we move up the hierarchy. And I like to give this hierarchical, I like to define something called hierarchical power, which is just 1 plus the number of subordinates. Now, I add 1 to the number of subordinates just because I think the person at the bottom of a hierarchy, even though they have no subordinates, the person at the bottom of a hierarchy um, still has some power. They still have control over themselves. So I add 1 to the number of subordinates just to symbolize that. Now, so to revisit this principle, hierarchy concentrates power. And the second principle is that those with power tend to use it to hoard resources, right? Elites are selfish, and if given the chance, they will use their power to hoard resources. So, if this is true, then hierarchical power, sorry, income should grow with hierarchical power. And in fact, it does. So, what I'm plotting here is the way that income on the vertical axis relates to hierarchical power. So, by definition, um, if you're at the bottom of a hierarchy, you have hierarchical power 1, and your relative income is 1. And as you move up the hierarchy, your power grows, and so does your income. And I've plotted 4 different data sources here. So the purple dots are the US military. The green dots are case study firms. So people have gone out and measured hierarchies within um, different firms, about 6 of them. And the blue are US CEOs, as mostly Fortune 500 CEOs. And then the red is actually, which is a big outlier on this plot, is the slave plantation. I managed to find some data on a 19th century slave plantation. So there's a pretty strong correlation here. So as hierarchical power increases, so does relative income. So when I say that hierarchy drives inequality, this is what I mean. Now, what does this have to do with degrowth? Well, here's some plausible reasoning. If we use less energy, that's going to come uh, with less hierarchy. Basically, we'll reverse the trend that we saw in the past. In the past, we used more energy and we had more hierarchy. So, plausibly, in a degrowth future, regardless of how it happens, that trend will just reverse. We'll use less energy and have less hierarchy. Well, if we have less hierarchy, might we also have less inequality? And I'm going to actually say that the answer is probably no, unless we take extra steps to mitigate inequality. And I'm going to walk you through the reasons why. And I'm going to use a model of hierarchy that has 3 features. It has a span of control, which I'll talk about what that is. It has a size, so the number of people that work in the hierarchy, and then it has what I call a degree of hierarchical despotism. So let's talk about the span of control. Um, Now, what is the span of control? Well, it's just the number of direct subordinates per superior. So here's what it looks like. So I've illustrated two hierarchies here. Both have 31 members, but they have differing spans of control. The hierarchy on the left has a span of control 5, which means that each superior controls 5 subordinates. And the one on the right has a span of control 2. What changes is not the size of the hierarchy, but its shape. So we have a flat hierarchy on the left and a steep hierarchy on the right. And why does this matter for income inequality? Well, according to the evidence, income scales with hierarchical power. And what the span of control does by changing the shape of a hierarchy is um, influence the concentration of hierarchical power. So by concentration of hierarchical power, remember that I define hierarchical power as 1 plus the number of subordinates. So by concentration of hierarchical power, I mean that we go through a hierarchy and measure the number of subordinates that each individual has and calculate the distribution of hierarchical power. And then I would take the Gini index of hierarchical power concentration, which, if you're not familiar with the Gini index, it can range from 0 being perfect equality to 1 being perfect inequality. So, why does this matter? Well, concentrated power concentrates income. So, the span of control can perhaps influence income inequality in a hierarchy. But I actually find that this effect is not that great. So going back to the two hierarchies that I mentioned, both with 31 members, one that's flat on the left with a large span of control and one that's steep on the right, I've gone in my model and measured the Gini index of hierarchical power in both of them, and I find that they're more or less the same. So the take-home message here is that uh, changing the span of control isn't actually a very good way to limit inequality in a hierarchy, and I'll come back to that in a second. Now, what about the size of the hierarchy? So this is important for degrowth because if the if past trends hold, we expect that hierarchy size should be reduced if we decrease less energy. So um, hierarchy, the size of a hierarchy does affect the concentration of power. And again, I'll measure this concentration with the Gini index just to illustrate the principle. If we start with one person who's self-employed, well, it's not really a hierarchy at all, but that's our baseline. The Gini index of power concentration is 0. Now, the interesting feature of hierarchy is that almost immediately, as soon as you add more people, power becomes more concentrated. So the Gini index, when you have 3 people in the hierarchy, 1 superior, 2 subordinates, the Gini index of hierarchical power immediately explodes. So there's this very nonlinear effect with hierarchy, which I will come back to. Now, it continues to grow as we add more people to the hierarchy. The Gini index continues to grow, but it eventually plateaus. So there's a very nonlinear effect with inequality um, when you grow a hierarchy, or conversely, when you shrink it. So this is important. We'll come back to it. But let's lastly talk about the degree of hierarchical despotism. Now, this is a provocative name that I basically just give to a model parameter. So I've found that income is proportional to hierarchical power, and the slope of this proportionality, which is it's actually a power law, I just call D. But I give D this provocative name called the degree of despotism because I think it represents something provocative. Uh, by converting hierarchical power into income, basically you're subverting what is useful about a hierarchy. So the way I see a hierarchy is that it's useful because it coordinates people. It allows people to coordinate their action. And yet it can be pathological. Indeed, it is pathological when elites use their power to hoard income. So the rate at which they do this, I call the degree of hierarchical despotism. So just to illustrate what this means, going back to this relation between income and hierarchical power, I've replotted the actual empirical data here in gray, and over top of it, I've illustrated just some what can happen with different values for the degree of despotism. So when D is low, like zero point 0.1, for instance, if somebody, imagine a CEO who had a million subordinates. If despotism is low, around zero point 0.1, that CEO is only going to earn about 5 times the average income of a typical employee or a low ranked employee. Whereas if despotism is high, the same CEO might earn 1 million times a low ranking employee. So there's this huge effect on income inequality. And I've put this into a model just to see what happens. And again, I'm looking here at income inequality, the Gini index on the vertical axis, and the degree of hierarchical despotism on the horizontal axis. So this is what happens as you ramp up income inequality in this hierarchy, and it's got 100,000 people in it, so it's a very large hierarchy, about the size of Microsoft. You can either have almost unbelievable equality or unbelievable inequality. And just to give you some perspective on this, um, the these vertical lines are the extremes of inequality found in the World Bank database. So the World Bank reports income inequality in countries, and so the Czech Republic is at the extreme low end. In 1992, the Czech Republic had a Gini index of about zero point 0.2, whereas on the upper end, Malawi had a Gini index of about 0.65 in 1997. So by varying the degree of despotism, um, we can reproduce this extreme inequality or extreme equality. So what's the point that I'm trying to make here? Well, it's a bit complex, but let me try to put it all together. Basically, the three features of hierarchy all influence inequality, but they do so in very different ways. And this chart here illustrates that. Um, the span of control. So think about making a firm flatter. It seems like you're reducing hierarchy, and in a way, you are. But what my model suggests is that that doesn't have a very strong effect on income inequality. So here, I'm plotting the Gini index here in my model, and uh, on the bottom here is the normalized parameter. So all these features of hierarchy size, despotism, span of control, those parameters can vary, but I've just plotted them on the same scale. So with this blue curve here, that's changing the span of control. So as the span of control grows, the hierarchy gets flatter and income inequality decreases. Um, but it's not a very large effect. So it's a hard way to decrease inequality. Now, what about hierarchy size? And I think this is important for degrowth because as um, uh, as energy use decreases in the future, I think it's plausible that hierarchy will also decrease. But there's a problem, and this curve, this green curve, illustrates the problem, at least according to my model. So imagine taking a country like, a company like Microsoft and shrinking it until there's a significant um, reduction in income inequality. and ask yourself how far would we have to shrink it until the hierarchy shed enough ranks that income inequality decreased significantly? And the answer, at least according to this model, is that we would have to shrink it about 99%. So we would have to shrink Microsoft down until it had about 1,000 employees. And only then would decreasing hierarchy further significantly reduce income inequality. So this is an unintuitive feature of a hierarchy, um, but it basically has to do with the way the span of control works. The span of control is nested, and that means as we get to very large hierarchies, new ranks are added or subtracted, depending if the hierarchy is growing, at a very slow rate. Whereas when the hierarchy is small, ranks are added rapidly. Um, so this nonlinear effect means that unless we have drastic reduction in the size of a hierarchy, it's unlikely to lead to more inequality. Whereas um, the exact reverse is true with what I call despotism, and that's just simply the rate at which people convert their power into income. So despotism is this red curve, and it has a drastic effect on income inequality. And I think that's important because it means all is not lost. So talking about degrowth, a degrowth future, if we use less energy, I think it's plausible that we'll have less hierarchy in the future. It's just going to reverse the trends of the past. And it would be nice to think that if we use less energy, that would lead automatically to an equal society, an equitable society. But the problem is, I don't think this is true. At least my modeling efforts suggest this is not true. That if we shrink our firms and our governments uh, from consuming less, this is not going to lead automatically to an equitable world. And I'm going to close with just some evidence on that front that can kind of help us think about these things. Um, if we want degrowth, all is not lost because what we really need to do is limit hierarchical despotism. And we can just, I'm going to show you some evidence from real world institutions just to try to guide um, our thinking on this front. So, what I'm showing here are my estimates for the degree of hierarchical despotism within different institutions. And just to remind you, this is degree of hierarchical despotism. That's my name for the rate that income grows with power, hierarchical power in a hierarchy. So on the very low end, perhaps surprisingly, is a military, the U.S. military. The U.S. military may have a strict chain of command, but it's actually surprisingly equal. So the degree of despotism um, is very low. Now, is that a feature of the U.S. Or of all militaries, I should say? And I think the answer is no. There are very despotic militaries out there, especially when they um, run the government, when there's a military dictatorship. So the reason the U.S. military is so equal, I think, is very clear. It's because it's under civilian control, and the U.S. government itself is um, uh, responsible to uh, voters. And voters really don't like it when politicians or public officials enrich themselves on the public purse. So the pay in the US military is strictly limited. Now, on the opposite end is a very small institution called Cannon's Point. Now, so this is actually a slave estate in the US in the 19th century. Um, so the owner of Cannon's Point had about 100 slaves, and also that's by modern standards very small. We would say that's a pretty small firm. But this slave estate, the owner, by my estimates, earned about 100 times the living standard of an average slave, which translates into enormous hierarchical despotism. Now, I don't think it's surprising that a slave estate would be despotic. If you think about a slave um, estate, it's kind of the purest form of hierarchy. So a hierarchy is the top down, uh, is defined by the top down flow of power. In purest form, there's no reverse flow of accountability. There's no bottom up accountability. A slave is somebody who's lost um, the ability to hold their owner, their ruler, to account. So it's unsurprising that a slave estate would plumb the depths of despotism. Um, Now, what does this have to do with a degrowth future? Well, many degrowth writers and theorists tend to focus on a bright future, what I would call an ecotopia, where we're consuming fewer resources and at the same time we're living in a pleasant society. Um, the problem with this is, obviously, I would like to live in that world, but the problem is that it's not guaranteed to happen. We could easily end up in some sort of eco feudalism. And this graph kind of illustrates that, right? This slave estate here, Cannon's Point slave estate, was an agrarian institution. And agrarian societies use orders of magnitude less energy than an industrial country like Canada. So, in terms of degrowth, they're far more sustainable, and yet completely despotic. I would not want to or wish anybody to live in this slave estate. And yet, when we say measure its material consumption, it would be extremely or far more sustainable, say, than the U.S. military. The U.S. military consumes just vast quantities of energy, and yet, in terms of income distribution within the hierarchy, extremely equal. So, if we want, the take home message here is that if we want to maintain uh, uh, a society worth living in, we need to limit, I think, hierarchical despotism, and that will stave off, hopefully, eco feudalism. All right. Thank you, guys.
Uh, Michelle, did you want to start off with one of the questions we prepared?
Well, maybe first a clarification, because the way they use the word despotism,
Hmm.
and I think maybe the slave thing is a good example. But generally speaking, I think human evolution was that in feudal type societies, personal despotism was very high. The power of a person over another person
Hmm.
was very direct, and it was all about
Hmm.
fealty, loyalty, very harsh punishments. You'd go in a modern corporation, um, and the pay grade is and the capital ownership is very unequal. But at the same time, the kind of working environment, is very much about a bunch of experts that need to work together, and
Hmm.
it kind of appears in some way to be more soft and equal. So have you thought about that, like
Yep.
the way you use despotism and the way that people maybe understand despotism a bit
Yeah. So
differently?
I am using the word in a kind of technical way here, only referring to income, not necessarily the strength of the power relations, which is how I think most people would interpret it. Uh, I have, though, very roughly tried to go back and look at this sort of thing, and from the data that I can tell, it does look like. So there are two things at work that kind of make it confusing. On the one hand, just the scale of hierarchy tends to grow with energy use. And by its nature, when that happens, the top pays seem to skyrocket. So, for instance, um, we see this all the time just in our life, but you don't really pay it any matter. Like I grew up working in a small company, small clothing firm in my hometown, and the the business owner did well, and they maybe made I don't know 4 or 5 times what the average employee made, which seemed like a lot to me. But then when you scale that up to um, a Fortune 500 company, say like Facebook, um, Mark Zuckerberg, depending on how you take into account his stock ownership, can earn 10,000 times the average employee. Well, we take that, we see that value, and we say, "Wow, that's extreme inequality." But the fact is that he's running a huge company, which to take this into in the big picture is far larger than most feudal hierarchies. So feudal hierarchies, I would say, were despotic, both in the sense of the strength of the power relation, but also I suspect, and we don't have very good data on this, but I suspect in the rate that income grew with power, but they were very small. um, Even a major feudal lord or a major slaveholder, say, would maybe have 1,000 serfs, maybe 10,000 maximum. Whereas 10,000 uh, employees is not a big company now. It's a medium-sized company. We have companies like Walmart with millions of employees. We have governments with millions of employees too. And so you can find it, what seems like a paradox in that the uh, top CEOs can earn vast incomes, which completely dwarf that of the average worker, and yet the hierarchy overall is probably more equal than the feudal hierarchy, just because we have to take into account that it's extremely large, and when income grows with each rank, there's just that many more ranks to see an extreme income. But that CEO is also very rare. So it's not necessarily a paradox that when you look inside modern corporations, um, the actual working relations seem quite equal between ranks, and the income itself may be fairly equal between adjacent ranks. But when it's a huge corporation, there's still that there's so much room for big disparities between the top and the bottom. Unfortunately, this is something that's not well studied either in modern corporations or in feudal uh, um, manners. And the problem is just there's not a lot of data. The firm data, I bang my head up against this all the time, right? The data is proprietary for firms, and they don't want you to know what their pay grades are.
Right. Okay, so I have another question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
That's something that struck me, and I'm not sure if I completely remember what you said, but I it triggered me. Is you said something about like 1,000 employees as
Hmm.
some kind of limit. So in our wiki at the P2P Foundation, we have this whole area about group thresholds.
Hmm.
And like you have 7 people, 25 people, and each time that an organization reaches a certain threshold, the dynamics change for some reason. Like for example, if you do a startup under 25, everybody knows each other.
Hmm.
There's a kind of dynamism. There's one group, and then suddenly you can see already at 25 there's some kind of bureaucracy is kind of start to function. You get factions. The new
Hmm.
the new people that come in no longer have the same enthusiasm as the first group. They just come for the job. They're not kind of the same motivation. Anyway,
Hmm.
so in a similar way, if you would organize hierarchy differently. So what was that about that 1,000 as a
So I
threshold?
think
Because
you're
that
maybe
could be,
referring to
yeah.
150 Dunbar's number. Is that what you're?
150 is one of these threshold. There's more,
Yeah.
now this is studied more in detail, and I
Mm,
looked into this some years ago, and you have various,
sure.
under like 7, 25. They each time it changes. And
Mm.
so what you
Oh,
were
I
saying
remember.
is
Yeah.
that you said something that changes 1,000. And what it struck me is, well, maybe that would be like if you had an antitrust policy,
Oh,
that
so
it
that
might,
number came up in my.
yeah,
I was imagining this hypothetical situation where we took a big company like Microsoft and started to shrink it down, basically break it up maybe, um, until each little part had much less inequality. So the in my and this was a model that I was doing it in, and what I found basically in this model is that you don't get any significant reduction in inequality until you've gotten down to about 1,000 members. Now, that exact value depends on, for instance, the span of control, which I just picked a value. So I wouldn't make too much of that exact value. But I think it is actually important in a kind of bigger sense, in the sense that, the looming question in a lot of the social sciences was why we have inequality at all, right? We have so much evidence that we evolved as a fairly equal species, and we know that hunter gatherers, at least as many of them exist today, are very equal. And yet everywhere we look in civilization, there's inequality. It never really goes away. And I think my answer to this is that it's about hierarchy. As soon as you have any kind of hierarchy at all, even if it's quite smaller, you suddenly have inequality. And that stems from the chain of command. Um, Now, you could say, well, we should just get rid of the hierarchy, but I think that's a catch 22, because I do think um, that hierarchy has a purpose. Its purpose is not necessarily to benefit people per se, but I think it allows hierarchical groups to outcompete non-hierarchical groups, often just because size is an advantage. So if that's the case, then there's an advantage to hierarchy, but it's pathological in the sense that humans are not a purely altruistic a species. You can't put somebody at the top of a large hierarchy and say you have absolute power. Please don't abuse it. Like 90% of people are going to use that power to benefit themselves to some extent, and then you have the psychopaths who will just do terrible things with it. But just even the most benign person, I think, will say, well, I deserve a raise, and so I have the power to get one. um, yeah, so that's a feature of hierarchy that I'm fascinated by, in that it's extremely non-linear, and you would think that breaking up a large hierarchy might lead to inequality, or sorry, lead to more equality, and it will if you go long, if you break it up into small enough pieces. But you have to go a long, long way before you see a significant um, reduction,
right. But
at
that's
least
that's what I
in
find
according to.
interesting in your approach is that you could actually conclude then that, maybe if you want to have a more equal society, that we would have to know about that threshold, and
Mhm.
so organize ourselves in groups of 1,000 would be an approach, in terms of organizational size, that could be, in a series of solutions. I think that might be something to look at. That's kind of what I find interesting in your saying that. Yeah.
Yeah, it is definitely something to look at. Um, Kind of my point though is that assuming that we're kind of stuck with hierarchy. I mean, I like to scheme about societies. This is kind of my anarchist tendency. I like to scheme about societies that lack any sort of hierarchy, but I find it very implausible when I try to imagine it happening. So, assuming we're stuck with hierarchy, that chain of command, the best thing you can do is make it accountable. And I think the more you make it accountable, the more it almost isn't a hierarchy anymore. That's not the right word for it. So, for instance, Michael Albert wrote a book about participatory economics, and he kind of imagines a hierarchy in the sense that there's nested sets of
Right.
councils. So there's that nesting structure, which is the basic feature of a hierarchy, but he imagines it without the power dynamic. So there's kind of this pure accountability from the bottom where you, yes, we'll vest power to this person at the next level, but at any point we can take that power back if we don't find that you're doing a good job. So if you imagine a chain of, not, it's not a chain of command, that's the wrong word, but a nested structure where there's kind of extreme bottom up accountability, you could plausibly have a very large, for lack of a better word, hierarchy, but it would still be very equal. So that's another, I think,
Yeah.
approach that's
I
plausible.
I have another suggestion, and to see what you think about it. And so the notion is that of anti-oligarchic protocols. So if you read books like Societies Against the State from Pierre Clastres,
Hmm.
and the book by Marshall Salins about the original abundant society, what you see is that tribal civilizations had actually a whole series of protocols
Hmm.
that continuously rebalanced the drive towards hierarchy.
Hmm.
So they knew it was happening, but and they kind of dealt with it by all kinds of techniques, like the potlatch, where the surplus would be feasted, um, and by limiting the power of the chief, and there are all kinds of techniques that they use. And I looked briefly at medieval cities where they also had that. The guild cities had all kinds of methods. For example, in Dubrovnik, the as soon as the mayor was elected, um, the he was kind of imprisoned in his villa,
Hmm.
right? So anybody who visited him would have to sign a paper, and so corruption was kind of very difficult to do. And so I'm just thinking in today that in networks, in collective intelligence, in collaborative ecosystems, that we could be working on these anti-oligarchic protocols, so that we would recognize that hierarchy is natural, that it arises from the
Hmm.
interactions, and at the same time would say, well, we can kind of moderate it, and
Hmm.
there's would kind of imagine a science of protocols that continuously rebalance the drive.
Yeah. Well, and something that I've written about in other places, but I think is worth mentioning, is one of the key drivers, I think, of hierarchy is group competition, intense group competition. So I think that's given us, personally, I think group competition is why it's given us some of the nicest features of humanity, but also some of the worst. So I think group competition is a main reason why we're very social animals. So we're social because we organize in groups. But once you have very intense group competition, I think there's can be a very strong pressure to have hierarchy. And one of my favorite authors on this is Peter Turchin, who says, why did um, the original agrarian societies, why would they let these despotic rulers, and they were, I mean, if you believe the writing that's that they left behind, just insanely despotic, why would these societies organize uh, under these rulers? And his argument is basically, well, uh, similar to what we see now. Like the ruler would say, well, just give me some power and I will organize the military and we'll defeat our enemies, and then I'll give up the power, after. But then they wouldn't give up the power, right? So we see it just happens over and over and over again. When you get an us versus them dynamic, a strong leader can come along and accumulate a lot of power. So it's something that um, I think we constantly have to guard against. So you can should focus on how to limit power within your own group, let's say, but you have to also then take in the dynamics of other groups. But I agree, that's something that is very interesting. All the dynamics, all the systems that have evolved to kind of check power, I'm interested in, and I don't think they're researched
Mm.
enough personally.
And maybe one more question because I'm not sure it's in your text for Spider, but I think I read it somewhere else that you also explain multi-level selection theory. Right? I think you were
Yes, I'm
interested
very
in that.
interested in
Yeah.
that. I don't think I put that in the spider's text. If I did, it was only in passing. I think that's absolutely essential to understanding our place in the web of life. So maybe if I can do a little, I'll do a little 1 minute summary. So uh, if you look at the grand scheme of life, there's been these huge evolutionary transitions, and this idea of multi-level selection um, kind of explains what's going on. So, just to frame it, the idea of multi level selection is that there can be selection at any level, not only the individual, which is what most people think of when they think of Darwinism, is that individuals are competing with each other. Well, they are, but multi level selection says, well, you can actually look at groups. And in fact, what even is an individual? How did they become an individual? So you can go all the way down. And in evolutionary history, I was fascinated to just look at the whole spectrum of it. And what it is a spectrum of what were previously autonomous units organizing in groups. And you basically can go to the very beginning of life, molecules somehow organizing into proteins. And then they become a new group. And whenever this happens, you have this new group suppressing competition within itself, and and then competing amongst other groups. So then we got cells, and so cells, they suppress competition within themselves and then start to compete with other cells. Then you got multicellular organisms. So we're multicellular organisms, and our bodies suppress competition within ourselves. So and when we fail to do that, that's something called cancer, when individual cells multiply unbounded. Um, and then humans or social animals are really the next step. They're individual organisms, multicellular organisms, organizing in large groups. Um, so the most well recognized outside of humans are ants, the eusocial insects. But humans have kind of taken this to a huge new level. And I think group selection or multi-level selection is important to understand it. And at the center of it really is this dynamic between selfishness and altruism. And trying to remember the catchphrase, I'll try to do it justice. So this idea that within groups, selfishness always trumps altruism. So if I'm in an army, let's say, and that army is attacking another group, it's always best for me to lay at the back of the army, and I won't die, and my relative fitness will increase. But when everybody does that, it's catastrophic. So selfish individuals trump um, altruistic individuals within groups, but between groups, altruism is best. So if you have an altruistic group, it will trump a group of individualists. So this dynamic really lies at the center of the evolution of our capacity for altruism. So the reason, so it, if you believe this theory, the reason that humans are social animals and that we help other people is because we've evolved to do so, and it's been a group level um, selection to do that, and at the same time we suppress um, selfishness. So we've and this is not only I should say genetic evolution; it's also cultural evolution. Um, so I've been mostly influenced by the biologist David Sloan Wilson, who's been a tireless champion of this idea of multi-level selection, and now he's really branched out into researching cultural evolution from that lens. So it's really influenced my thinking.
Yeah, I think I'm through with my questions. So, Rock, maybe you have a few more, or maybe it's time to wrap up. I'm not sure.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for all of that. I have maybe just one more follow-up question.
Hmm.
Um, so in your paper, Blair, you kind of end with the kind of idea that the causal direction between degrowth and social hierarchy remains rather unclear. In
Hmm.
our discussion, we sort of mentioned a bit about the drivers of hierarchy or path dependencies, if you will. Maybe we can focus a little bit on challenges of de-hierarchization in terms of drivers, leverages to be used,
Yeah.
because I suppose also today when we despotism or the kind of new rise of authoritarianism,
Hmm.
but at the same time the states, for example, being historically positioned to have regulative legitimacy, or the only body with the regulative legitimacy that's required to intervene in markets, even individual firms, and so on. Very much so also in the context of climate change and vis-a-vis that degrowth. You talked a lot about accountability, bottom-up accountability.
Hmm.
Maybe there's some other drivers of de-hierarchization that are not currently in the formula, so to say.
Hmm. Well, I mean, first off, I'll just admit that there's a lot that we don't know. So I'm basically speculating here, but let's speculate. What I like about the this thinking is that it takes um, the focus off of consumption. So right away when you talk degrowth, um, you're automatically just talking about the choice to consume less, which is fine. But uh, you're not necessarily focusing on the social relations that lead to that consumption. And in my mind, that's everything. I can try to consume less in my daily life, but it's really my social relations with everybody around me that basically stop me from doing that. It's almost impossible, right? We're social animals. It's impossible for us to do things on our own. So what I like about focusing on hierarchy is that it kind of clarifies what is otherwise in the background, which is that rather than try to limit consumption directly, it may be that we can change our social relations, and the effect will be to limit consumption. And I think that in some ways is more um, palatable. So I'm on Twitter, and there's I won't mention names, but economists, well-known economists, um, basically saying degrowth is can't happen. It's a terrible idea. And probably if you asked an average working class American, how would you feel about consuming less? They would say, well, it's a terrible idea. Well, because nobody wants to have less stuff when it because it, they're just imagining, well, I get less, but all my friends get to keep the same. Well, if instead you focus on changing the social relations, say for instance having less hierarchy, less despotism, and the reduction in consumption just comes from that, it's just a happy side effect. I think that's almost more palatable, and especially when you're talking about um, reining in inequality. So one thing I didn't do in the paper, but one thing I would like to look at is, for instance, just imagine that we achieve degrowth by rapidly decreasing inequality. So what I mean by that is take some baseline level, say the working class level of consumption, and rather than bringing everybody's level of consumption down, bring the top down, compress the top down to them. So Bill Gates just wrote a book about climate change, right? Meanwhile, he's flying around the world in jets, burning something like 1,600 tons of carbon, right? So I'm thinking, well, bring those elites, bring their consumption way, way, way down to everybody else's levels. How much would that actually reduce our use of energy? And I think it could be quite drastic. But what is exciting, just to kind of summarize, as you say, is that it's plausible just looking at the evidence on its own, although we don't really know, but it's plausible that if we try to reduce hierarchy, that the net effect would just be to that we consume less energy. And it's a very different way of looking at it. We start with the social relations, and the resource consumption follows. Whether that actually happens or not, uh, we won't know until we try.
Thank you for that. Maybe one more just follow-up idea, I suppose, or maybe a point for discussion. In talks of degrowth, a lot of the times people kind of take the slogan as face value and kind of, antithesis of degrowth, or a kind of, downturn of degrowth in and of itself. Whereas a lot of the argument also is kind of, hidden within the details of transitioning to very different kind of production and use models. So not consuming less per se, but consuming differently, right? For
Mm-hmm.
example, like um, sharing econ or like radical sharing economy models, and what that does to the throughput of energy and materials, for example, in vehicles and so on. You mentioned licensing as being, kind of a key issue. And what part of the commons movement, for example, has been a lot about, open sourcing production, um,
Mm-hmm.
and things like that. So maybe those are also some areas to work on as leverages for uh,
Mm-hmm.
the growth
Mm-hmm.
and the hierarchy.
Well, one thing to mention is uh, another way of looking at this that my colleague Jonathan Nitzen and Shimshon Bickler have explored more is that it one reason that energy may grow with hierarchy is that hierarchy is in some ways driving waste, and I think that's quite plausible. Uh, you take a look at big corporations, and a lot of what they're spending money on, a lot of the things that they're consuming aren't for anybody's benefit. It's just because that's what the hierarchy has decided to do to make a profit, right? So not only are they making, let's say, useless products that we don't really need, but they're also just internal to the hierarchy, driving consumption. Um, so if you want to look at it that way, there and this maybe kind of relates also to David Graeber's idea of bullshit jobs, where we have these layers of jobs that they're part of the hierarchy, they serve the hierarchy, but they don't necessarily serve um, humanity in any decent sense. Um, so I think there's a lot of areas um, like that to explore. It's definitely a good avenue
I
for
can maybe
research.
give a little anecdote because I used
Sure.
to be an executive 20 years ago, and I was literally living at 100 meters of my office. And so I told them I when I was hired, I don't need a car. And they literally obliged me to have a BMW because it was part of the prestige.
Mm,
And nobody at that level of the organization could even be seen driving with any more simple car. It just wasn't possible. And so I agree with you. A lot of these expenses are driven by the need to maintain status and prestige in inter-elite competition. Because you
yeah.
always, when you're whatever level you are, even if you have 50 billion, what you're looking at is the other people
Hmm.
with in your similar level, and you want to be better than them because otherwise you are losing prestige
Hmm.
compared to them. And I think that's a really huge dynamic. I
Mm-hmm.
just wanted to confirm that I think this is, and this is automatic. There's, as an individual, there's very little you can do against it.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm.
the social logic that does that. Yeah.
Right. So I suppose, yeah, it's time for our final question, which we again ask all our guests, which is kind of for our listeners and viewers, where could they, you've mentioned some of the materials that have been your own inspiration. Maybe we can have another roundup of those, and maybe some others, also networks, initiatives, and so forth, that kind of deal with this question of hierarchy and degrowth.
Sure.
It would be good to highlight.
Sure. Well, I will say that I blog regularly about my own research. So the name of my blog is Economics from the Top Down. So I write about my own research and other ideas that I think are interesting. More broadly about hierarchy. So I have been very influenced by a school of thought called capital as power, which basically takes the idea of capital as not a thing, not machines and infrastructure per se, but a financial magnitude. Um, and so that there's a website called capitalaspower.com where there are many people contributing research, and there's a very dynamic forum, which I think is one of the best places to talk about hierarchy, just because these are people who are already interested, very interested in power dynamics in society. So there's great discussion going on there. And then more generally, just in terms of uh, reading, one of my favorite journals is called the Real World Economics Journal. So one of the great things about that is that it's free. You don't need any academic subscription, and it's very well written. So it's written um, so that I think anybody can read it. You don't need a specialized training in economics, and that's really the way it should be, right? We're talking about ideas that are central to a democratic society, and so we should all be thinking about them. We don't need, like, the jargon of economics really obfuscates from having a wider discussion. So if you're interested in these ideas, so I have published in that journal too, but it's just um, in general a fantastic journal where ideas that are not allowed in prestigious academic journals and neoclassical economic journals are um, are allowed to flourish. So degrowth, ideas about degrowth, um, criticizing capitalism, you name it, it's probably been published at some point in that journal.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm sure our listeners will appreciate those plugins and ways that, yeah, they can engage with all of this material that's being generated. Uh,
Thank you.
with, with that, thank you so much, Blair, for joining us today and discussing with us a little bit about this specific topic. As said, we think it's one of the key topics that we should be talking about in tandem with others in this compendium. Yeah, thanks so much again.
Thank you for having me. My pleasure.